The morning of my wedding should have been filled with joy and anticipation. Instead, I stood in my childhood bedroom, staring at my reflection in the antique mirror that had belonged to 3 generations of women before me. My wedding dress, a simple but elegant ivory gown that complemented the rustic charm of our family ranch, felt heavy with the weight of tradition. Downstairs, I could hear the bustle of preparation. Caterers arranging tables under the old oak tree where Grandma used to tell me stories. Florists positioning arrangements of wildflowers and baby's breath throughout the garden she had lovingly tended for decades. Everything was perfect, exactly as I had dreamed since I was a little girl playing bride with her old lace curtains. But something felt wrong. Dad had been acting strange for weeks, avoiding eye contact during our conversations about the future. When I'd asked about expanding the cattle operation after the wedding, he'd changed the subject. When I'd mentioned wanting to renovate the old barn into a workshop, he'd mumbled something about, "We'll see." I smoothed my dress one final time and made my way downstairs. The guests were already arriving, neighbors who had known our family for generations, college friends who had driven hours to celebrate with me, and relatives who rarely visited, but wouldn't miss such an occasion. That's when I saw my brother Jake talking intensely with Dad near the barn. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in their postures. Jake's hands were gesturing animatedly, while Dad stood with his arms crossed, his face wearing that stubborn expression I knew so well. Little did I know that in just a few hours, my entire world would come crashing down with a single sentence that would reveal everything I thought I knew about my family was wrong. The ceremony was beautiful. Standing under Grandma's oak tree, surrounded by 4 generations of love and memories, I felt connected to something larger than myself. My new husband's eyes sparkled with tears as we exchanged vows, promising to build our life together on this land that had raised me. As we walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, I caught sight of Grandma's old recipe book sitting on the gift table. Someone had placed it there as decoration. Probably Mom, who loved to incorporate family heirlooms into special occasions. The worn leather cover and yellowed pages had always fascinated me as a child, though Grandma had been surprisingly protective of it, never letting me look through it properly. The reception was in full swing when Dad clinked his glass, requesting everyone's attention. I assumed he was going to give the traditional father of the bride speech, perhaps sharing an embarrassing childhood story or welcoming my new husband to the family. Instead, his words cut through the celebration like a knife through butter. Before we continue with the festivities, I have an important announcement to make about the future of our ranch. My heart began to race. This wasn't the time or place for business discussions. Guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the change in atmosphere. After much consideration, I've decided to sell the ranch. Jake has made an excellent offer, and the papers will be signed next week. Every acre, every building, every head of cattle, it's all going to him. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Someone's glass hit the ground with a sharp crack. My new husband's hand found mine, squeezing tightly as if to anchor me to reality. This was my wedding day. The ranch was my birthright, my future, my everything. How could he do this now, in front of everyone, without even discussing it with me first? The rest of the reception passed in a blur of forced smiles and whispered conversations. Guests didn't know whether to offer congratulations or condolences. Some approached me with confused sympathy, while others simply avoided eye contact altogether. The celebration that should have been the happiest day of my life had become a wake for my dreams. I found myself standing alone by the dessert table, mechanically cutting pieces of wedding cake while my mind reeled. The ranch house, where I had planned to raise my children, would belong to Jake. The stables where I had learned to ride, the fields where I had helped with harvest, the creek where Grandma had taught me to fish, all of it would be his. My brother had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in Dad's eyes. But this felt like more than favoritism. This felt like betrayal. "Congratulations on your marriage, sweetheart." I turned to find Great Aunt Margaret, Grandma's sister, standing beside me. At 92, she was one of the few people left who remembered the early days of the ranch, when Grandma and Grandpa had built it from nothing. "I'm sorry about the ranch," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your grandmother would be rolling in her grave if she knew what your father just did." Something in her tone made me look closer. There was more than sympathy in her eyes. There was anger, and something else, something that looked almost like knowledge. "Aunt Margaret, what do you mean?" She glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "That recipe book of your grandmother's, the one on the gift table. Did you ever really look through it?" Before I could answer, she pressed something into my hand. It was a small, tarnished key. "Page 47, she whispered. "When you're ready to know the truth." Then she melted back into the crowd, leaving me staring at the mysterious key and wondering what secrets my family had been keeping. That night, after the last guest had gone home and my new husband had fallen asleep exhausted by the day's emotional roller coaster, I crept downstairs to retrieve Grandma's recipe book. The house felt different in the darkness, less like home and more like a place I was already losing. I settled into Grandma's old rocking chair in the kitchen, the one where she used to sit and shell peas while telling me stories about the old days. The recipe book felt heavier than I remembered, its leather binding worn smooth by decades of handling. I flipped through the familiar pages, Grandma's perfect handwriting documenting everything from her famous apple pie to the beef stew that had won 3 county fair blue ribbons. But as I approached page 47, my heart began to pound. There, tucked between buttermilk biscuits and Sunday pot roast, was a small envelope sealed with wax. The key Aunt Margaret had given me fit perfectly into a tiny lock I hadn't noticed before. Inside the envelope were documents that made my breath catch. Property deeds, signed and notarized, dating back to 1952. And there, in Grandma's unmistakable handwriting, was a letter addressed to me. "My dearest granddaughter," it began, "if you are reading this, then someone has tried to take what is rightfully yours. The ranch was never your father's to give away. It belongs to the women of this family, passed down through a trust I established long before he was born." I read on, my hands shaking. The documents showed that Grandma had placed the entire ranch in a family trust, with specific instructions that it would pass to the eldest granddaughter upon her marriage. Not to her sons, not to be sold, to me. Dad didn't own the ranch. He never had. He was merely the caretaker, and now he was trying to steal what was mine by right and by law. The next morning, I waited until Dad was alone in the barn before approaching him with the documents. My new husband had wanted to come with me for support, but this was something I needed to do myself. The papers felt like weapons in my hands, weapons I had never expected to need against my own father. Dad was checking on one of the pregnant mares when I found him. He looked up with a smile that faltered when he saw my expression. "We need to talk," I said, holding up the envelope. His face went pale when he recognized Grandma's handwriting. For a moment, he looked like the frightened little boy I remembered from old family photographs. "Where did you find that? Does it matter?" "What matters is that you lied to me, to everyone. You don't own this ranch, Dad. You never did." He sat heavily on a hay bale, suddenly looking far older than his 63 years. "You don't understand the pressure I've been under, the debts, the expenses. Jake offered to help with everything. By stealing my inheritance? It's not that simple." His voice was barely a whisper. The ranch has been losing money for years. The bank is threatening foreclosure. Jake has the resources to save it. I felt my anger wavering, replaced by confusion and hurt. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you ask for help? I could have found a way. What way? He interrupted, his frustration boiling over. You and your husband have student loans, a tiny apartment in town, and no experience running a ranch this size. Jake has his construction business, money in the bank, and a plan to turn this place around. But it's not yours to give him, I said firmly. And according to these documents, it's not his to take. The trust is clear. The ranch belongs to me now. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the soft sounds of horses moving in their stalls. Finally, Dad looked up at me with eyes full of pain and something else. Shame. I know, he whispered. God help me, I know. I found my brother in his truck, preparing to leave after helping clean up from the reception. When I knocked on his window, he rolled it down with a guilty expression that told me he already knew why I was there. We need to talk, Jake. He turned off the engine and got out, leaning against the truck bed with his arms crossed defensively. Look, sis, I know you're upset about the timing. The timing? I interrupted, incredulous. You think I'm upset about the timing? I showed him the documents, watching as his expression shifted from defensiveness to shock to something that might have been relief. You knew, I said, reading his face. You knew about the trust. Jake ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from our childhood whenever he was caught in trouble. Grandma told me about it years ago when I asked her about inheriting the ranch someday. She said it wasn't meant for the men in the family. Then why did you go along with Dad's plan? Because he's been lying to you about how bad things really are. Jake exploded, his composure finally breaking. The ranch isn't just losing money, it's hemorrhaging it. The bank is calling in loans, suppliers are demanding payment, and there's a lien on the cattle. If something doesn't change in the next month, we're going to lose everything anyway. I felt the ground shifting beneath me again. What are you talking about? Dad's been using credit to keep things running for 3 years now. He's mortgaged everything twice over, and I'm the only one with enough liquid assets to pay off the debts and keep the place running. Jake's voice softened as he saw the shock on my face. I thought if I could take over officially, I could save it for the family. For you, eventually, when things were stable again. But the trust gives you ownership, but it doesn't give you the money to save it. And Dad was too proud to tell you the truth about how desperate things have become. I stared at my brother, realizing that what I had seen as betrayal might have been an attempt at salvation. But that still didn't make it right. That evening, I called a family meeting. Dad, Jake, my new husband, and I gathered around the kitchen table where Grandma used to serve Sunday dinners. The recipe book sat in the center like evidence in a trial. I want the truth, I said firmly. All of it. No more secrets, no more half explanations. Dad took a shaky breath and began to speak. The story that emerged was far worse than I had imagined. The financial troubles had started 5 years ago when a drought devastated the crops and cattle prices plummeted. Instead of asking for help or considering scaling back operations, Dad had borrowed against the ranch to keep everything running at full capacity. I thought it was temporary, he said, his voice thick with regret. I thought the next year would be better, and the next. I kept borrowing, kept hoping, kept lying to myself about how bad it had gotten. The numbers were staggering. Between outstanding loans, unpaid bills, and accrued interest, the ranch owed nearly $500,000. Even if we sold every head of cattle and piece of equipment, it wouldn't be enough to clear the debts. That's when Jake came to me with his offer. Dad continued. He has the money to pay everything off and enough left over to modernize the operation. I thought it was the only way to save the place. Jake leaned forward, his expression earnest. I never wanted to steal anything from you. I just wanted to keep the ranch in the family. I was going to put it back in your name once it was profitable again. But that's not how trusts work, I said quietly, and it's not your decision to make. My husband, who had been silent throughout the discussion, finally spoke up. What if we found another way? All eyes turned to him. What do you mean? Dad asked. Well, the trust gives ownership to her, but it doesn't prevent partnerships or business arrangements. What if we work together to save it instead of fighting over who owns it? I looked around the table at the three most important men in my life, each of whom had tried to protect me in their own flawed way. For the first time since discovering the truth, I began to see a path forward that didn't require choosing between love and legacy. Unable to sleep, I returned to the recipe book, hoping to find more guidance from Grandma. As I flipped through the pages more carefully, I discovered other hidden treasures, notes tucked between recipes, margin comments that revealed her thoughts about family and responsibility. On the page for healing chicken soup, she had written, "Some wounds need time and patience to heal, just like this broth needs to simmer slowly." Near her famous cornbread recipe, a note read, "The secret ingredient is always love, but sometimes love means making hard choices that others don't understand." And then, tucked behind the very last recipe, I found another letter. This one was addressed to future generations in Grandma's careful script. "The ranch is more than land and buildings," she had written. "It is the physical manifestation of our family's commitment to each other and to the stewardship of this beautiful place. But land without family is just dirt, and family without purpose is just people living in the same house." She went on to explain her reasoning for the trust structure. "I gave the ranch to the women, not because men are incapable, but because women understand that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is ask for help. Women know that raising children, whether they are human children or baby calves, requires a community." The letter concluded with advice that felt like she was speaking directly to my current situation. If the time comes when you must choose between the letter of the law and the spirit of love, choose love. But make sure it's a love that builds up rather than tears down, a love that includes rather than excludes. I sat back in the rocking chair, feeling Grandma's presence so strongly I could almost smell her lavender perfume. She had given me more than ownership of the ranch. She had given me the wisdom to know what to do with it. By dawn, I had a plan. I called another family meeting for the next evening, but this time I had prepared a proposal. Using everything I had learned about business from my college courses and my job at the Agricultural Extension Office, I had sketched out a plan that could save the ranch while honoring both the trust and the family's needs. "I've been thinking about what Grandma would want," I began, placing the recipe book on the table. "She wanted the ranch to stay in the family, but she also wanted it to thrive. I think there's a way to accomplish both." I spread out papers showing my research into agricultural grants, sustainable farming practices, and agritourism opportunities. The ranch can be profitable again, but it needs to evolve. We can't keep doing things the way we always have. My proposal was comprehensive. Jake would become a business partner, investing his money in exchange for a percentage of future profits rather than ownership. Dad would remain as ranch manager, using his years of experience while learning new sustainable practices. My husband and I would move into the ranch house and take over the day-to-day operations, implementing programs for farm-to-table restaurants, educational tours, and seasonal events. "We'd all be working together," I explained, "each contributing our strengths instead of competing for control." Jake studied the numbers carefully. "The agritourism angle is smart. People are hungry for authentic experiences these days." Dad looked skeptical. You really think city folks will pay money to watch us milk cows and gather eggs? I think they'll pay money to connect with where their food comes from, I replied. And I think Grandma would love the idea of the ranch becoming a place where families learn about the land the way she taught me. The room fell silent as everyone considered the proposal. Finally, my husband reached over and squeezed my hand. I think it's brilliant, and I think your grandmother would be proud. There's just one condition, I added, looking directly at Dad. No more secrets. If we're going to be partners, we need complete transparency about finances, decisions, everything. Dad nodded slowly, and for the first time in days, I saw hope in his eyes. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal consultations, bank negotiations, and family discussions. The trust documents proved to be ironclad. Grandma had been thorough in her planning. But untangling Dad's financial mess required the help of lawyers, accountants, and creditors who were surprisingly willing to work with us once they understood our comprehensive plan. During one particularly intense meeting with the bank, we discovered something that explained Dad's desperation. 3 years ago, he had co-signed a loan for a family friend whose business had failed. When the friend defaulted, Dad had become responsible for an additional $150,000 in debt, money he had never told any of us about. I couldn't let the Hendersons lose their farm, he said quietly when we confronted him. They've been our neighbors for 40 years. But I also couldn't bear to tell you I'd put our ranch at risk for someone else's dreams. It was another piece of the puzzle, another layer of pride and shame that had driven Dad to make increasingly desperate decisions. But it also showed the kind of man he was, someone who would sacrifice everything for his principles, even if those principles sometimes led him astray. Jake's investment, combined with a small business loan secured by our detailed business plan, was enough to pay off all the debts and provide working capital for the ranch's transformation. But more importantly, the process of working through these challenges together had begun to heal the wounds that the wedding day announcement had created. One evening, as we were reviewing contracts in the kitchen, Dad looked up from the papers and said, "I owe you an apology. All of you. I was so afraid of losing the ranch that I nearly destroyed the family in the process. We all made mistakes," I replied, "but Grandma was right. The secret ingredient is love, and love means being willing to forgive and start over." Jake nodded, then grinned. "Besides, someone has to keep you from turning this place into some kind of hippie commune with yoga classes for the chickens." For the first time in weeks, we all laughed together, and it felt like the beginning of something new. 6 months later, the ranch was transformed. The old barn had been converted into an event space where we hosted farm-to-table dinners featuring produce from our organic garden. The guest cottage, which had sat empty for years, now welcomed families wanting to experience ranch life, and the educational programs I had developed were booked solid with school groups and corporate retreats. But the biggest transformation was in our family. Jake had proven to be an excellent business partner, bringing organizational skills and financial acumen that complemented my agricultural knowledge and Dad's practical experience. My husband had embraced ranch life with enthusiasm, learning to ride horses and helping with everything from fence repairs to marketing our programs online. Dad, freed from the crushing weight of financial worry, had rediscovered his love for the land. He took special pride in leading tours for visitors, sharing stories about the ranch's history and the sustainable practices we had implemented. Watching him with wide-eyed children who had never seen a cow up close, I understood why Grandma had fallen in love with him all those years ago. The recipe book had found a new purpose as well. We displayed it in the event space, sharing Grandma's recipes with guests and telling the story of how her wisdom had saved our family ranch. Visitors were particularly charmed by the notes she had hidden throughout the pages, practical wisdom about cooking, life, and love that resonated across generations. One afternoon, while preparing for a wedding reception in the barn, I found myself thinking about my own wedding day and how differently things had turned out than I had planned. The betrayal that had seemed so devastating had actually been the catalyst for something better: a stronger family, a more sustainable business, and a deeper understanding of what legacy really means. As if reading my thoughts, Great-Aunt Margaret appeared at my elbow. At 93, she was still sharp as a tack and had become one of our most popular guest speakers for the historical tours. "Your grandmother would be so proud," she said, watching Jake and Dad work together to set up tables. "She always said that the best recipes required adaptation. You had to adjust for altitude, weather, and what ingredients you had on hand." I smiled, understanding the metaphor. We definitely had to adjust this recipe. "But the foundation stayed the same," she replied. "Family, land, and love. Everything else is just seasoning." A year after that devastating wedding announcement, we hosted our first annual Grandma's Recipe Revival Festival. Families from across the county came to share their own inherited recipes and stories, turning the ranch into a celebration of food, tradition, and community. I stood in the kitchen early that morning, using Grandma's recipe for cinnamon rolls to feed the volunteers. The familiar rhythm of mixing, kneading, and rising felt like a meditation, connecting me to all the women who had stood in this same spot, preparing food to nourish their families. My husband found me there as the sun was coming up, wrapping his arms around me from behind as I worked. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. I considered the question seriously. A year ago, I had expected to be living in town, visiting the ranch on weekends, while someone else made the day-to-day decisions. Instead, I was up at dawn every day, my hands permanently stained with dirt and my back aching from physical labor. Our bank account was smaller, our life was more complicated, and our future was less certain than it would have been with traditional jobs. "None," I said, meaning it completely. "This is exactly where I'm supposed to be." The festival was a tremendous success. Children fed chickens and collected eggs while their parents learned about sustainable farming. Teenagers who had never been outside the city discovered that they loved horseback riding. Elderly visitors shared stories about their own family farms, some long since sold or subdivided. But the most meaningful moment came when a young woman approached me near the end of the day. She was probably in her early 20s, with calloused hands and dirt under her fingernails that marked her as someone who worked the land. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "My family lost our farm 3 years ago when commodity prices crashed. I thought that dream was over forever. But seeing what you've built here, it gives me hope that there might be another way." I gave her Jake's business card and invited her to come back for our next workshop on sustainable agriculture. "The secret," I told her, "is remembering that farming isn't just about growing crops or raising animals. It's about growing communities and raising hope." As the last of the festival visitors drove away, our family gathered on the front porch to watch the sunset, just as Grandma used to do. The ranch looked different now, more vibrant, more alive, more purposeful than it had ever been. "So," Jake said, breaking the comfortable silence, "what's next?" I pulled out Grandma's recipe book, which had become my constant companion and guide. I was thinking we might try her recipe for Sweet Dreams pie. The instructions say it serves 8, but knowing Grandma, it probably feeds the whole county. And bye, everyone laughed, and as we headed inside to start yet another of Grandma's recipes, I realized that we had finally learned the most important lesson she had tried to teach us. The best things in life aren't owned or inherited. They're shared, adapted, and passed on with love. 5 years have passed since that fateful wedding day, and as I sit in Grandma's rocking chair with my 6-month-old daughter sleeping in my arms, I'm writing my own notes in the margins of the recipe book. Next to the cornbread recipe, I've added, Maya loves this teething. The texture is perfect for little gums. Near the beef stew, I've noted, Jake's addition of wine makes it even better. Don't tell Dad. The ranch has become everything we dreamed and more. We've been featured in agricultural magazines, won awards for sustainable farming, and inspired a dozen other families to save their own family farms through diversification and community engagement. But more importantly, we've created something that will endure for generations. My daughter will grow up knowing that she belongs to this land and that it belongs to her, not as property to be possessed, but as a trust to be protected. She'll learn, as I did, that the recipes for success in life, whether you're baking bread or building a business, require patience, adaptation, and the willingness to ask for help when the dough isn't rising properly. Jake and his wife are expecting their first child next month, and Dad has already started planning the nursery in the old tack room. This place needs more children, he says, his eyes twinkling with the joy that had been missing for so long. Grandma always said kids and calves grow better when they have room to run. My husband has become such an accomplished rancher that neighboring farms call him for advice. He jokes that he traded his law books for veterinary manuals, but I know he's never been happier. There's something about working with your hands and seeing the direct results of your labor that feeds the soul in ways that office work never could. As for me, I've learned that inheritance isn't just about what you receive, it's about what you choose to do with it. Grandma didn't just leave me a ranch. She left me a responsibility to nurture both the land and the people who depend on it. Every family that visits, every child who pets a calf for the first time, every young farmer who finds hope in our story becomes part of that legacy. The recipe book has inspired me to start writing my own collection, not just of food recipes, but of life lessons, family stories, and practical wisdom for future generations. I want my daughter to understand not just how to make Grandma's famous apple pie, but also how to navigate the complex recipe of family relationships, how to adapt when plans don't turn out as expected, and how to find sweetness even in the bitter moments. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm doing one last check on the animals, I walk past the oak tree where I was married and remember how different I thought my life would be. I had imagined a simple story. Girl inherits ranch, girl runs ranch, girl lives happily ever after. Instead, I got a much more complicated recipe that required more ingredients, took longer to cook, and demanded more skill to prepare properly. But just like Grandma's most challenging recipes, the extra effort was worth it. What we've built here isn't just a business or even a farm. It's a testament to the power of love, forgiveness, and the courage to start over when your first attempt burns in the oven. Next week, we're hosting our first Future Farmers Camp for teenagers interested in agricultural careers. One of the participants is the young woman who approached me at that first festival, now a recent agricultural school graduate with dreams of starting her own sustainable operation. The circle continues, just as Grandma planned. As I rock my sleeping daughter and plan tomorrow's work, I think about the note I'll add to the recipe book tonight. The most important ingredient in any recipe is hope. Without it, even the simplest dishes will fail. With it, you can turn mistakes into miracles and transform disasters into delicacies. Grandma would approve. After all, she always said the best cooks were the ones who could make something wonderful out of whatever ingredients life handed them.